17 months there and volunteered to go to Vietnam to get out of there. En route to Vietnam, I was sent to the 6-week MATA ARVN course that Dr. Birtle talked about at Fort Bragg, and then an 11-week Vietnamese language course at the Defense Language Institute in El Paso, Texas. Only the Army would send you to El Paso to learn Vietnamese. It goes without saying that 11 weeks of the Vietnamese language training in Texas proved a bit problematic once I arrived in country. I arrived in 1971, 2 years after President Nixon had announced his Vietnamization policy at Midway in June of '69. U.S. troop withdrawals from Vietnam had been going on since the fall of that year. By the time of my arrival, there were only 4 U.S. Army infantry battalions left in country. A total of less than 125,000 American troops remained. Upon arrival at Camp Alpha, where all the new arrivals showed up, a crusty old sergeant looked at me sort of quizzically and said, "What are you doing here? This war is over." He was proven fairly drastically wrong within about 4 months. Having studied Vietnamese in Texas, I was naturally assigned as an advisor with the Royal Thai Army in Vietnam, an 11,000-man division-sized force at Bearcat in Military Region 3. They were in the process of retrograding back to Thailand, so my sojourn at Bearcat was pretty short. I was told to go find a job, and to make a long story short, I ended up with the 18th ARVN Division located at Swan Lock, also in 3 Corps, Military Region 3. The 18th ARVN Division was not an elite unit, but rather it was one of 10 standard ARVN light infantry divisions, with 3 1,500-man infantry regiments, a division artillery regiment, and associated combat support elements. It had been in existence for about 10 years at this point in the war. I joined a division combat assistance team that Dr. Birtle talked about, a DCAT. These, as Dr. Birtle had pointed out, were pretty robust in the beginning. By the time I got there, they were beginning, or they had already been downsized and were continuing to do so as the overall U.S. troop numbers were dwindling. I was assigned to an 8-person regimental advisory team. My duties in the division over the next 8 months can be divided into 2 periods. During the initial months, I worked with all 3 battalions in the regiment, 48th Regiment at Black Horse. I was a captain with 2.5 years in the service on my first combat tour. So, like the general here, I also did meeting of those criteria. I was being asked to advise a 40-year-old ARVN battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, who had been fighting most of his adult life. I was well schooled in the infantry skills thanks to Fort Benning, but due to my lower rank, sometimes it was difficult to influence the individual battalion commanders that I worked with. Nevertheless, my job consisted of assisting in training and staff operations, acting as liaison with the few remaining U.S. units in the area, assisting in planning combat operations, and accompanying the battalions on those combat operations in the field, usually on 5 to 10-day missions looking for the North Vietnamese. On Good Friday, 31 March 1972, everything changed. The NVA launched its Easter offensive when 130,000 North Vietnamese regulars attacked south with T-54 tanks, heavy artillery, and great volumes of the latest Soviet and Chinese weaponry. The 18th Division at this time had a 2-battalion task force detached to the 5th ARVN Division up on the Cambodian border near An Loc, the provincial capital of Ben Long Province. The 5th VC Division took the border town of Loc Ninh in 48 hours, and also overran the attached task force from the 18th ARVN, my parent unit. The survivors of the task force were due to An Loc. At this point, another advisor and myself volunteered to fly to An Loc and replace the advisory team, which had been with the task force, but were wounded and evacuated during withdrawal into the city. What followed was different from anything I'd ever experienced or even conceived. An Loc, a town of about 15,000, 65 miles north of Saigon, had a garrison that numbered about 4,000 men by the time they marshaled all their forces. It was surrounded by 3 North Vietnamese divisions, over 30,000 enemy troops, armed with long-range artillery, tanks, and heat-seeking anti-aircraft missiles. The battle for the city raged day and night for the next 2.5 months. At this point, the focus of my efforts shifted to coordinating U.S. combat support. I spent all my time adjusting artillery, at least in the beginning, and pretty soon we had no artillery to adjust, airstrikes, and also coordinating attack helicopters and fixed-wing gunships, calling for dust-off medical evacuations, and coordinating aerial resupply of both rotary and fixed-wing. As I said earlier, this went on for 2.5 months. It was a desperate battle that seesawed back and forth as the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese forces fought each other, sometimes block to block, house to house, room to room. The ARVN held out while the NVA were pounded from the air. By mid-June, the issue was largely settled. The ARVN had held. The fighting continued, but at a much reduced in intensity. Nevertheless, I was wounded for the second time in July, and that was the end of my sojourn at An. Out of the hospital after a few weeks, I spent the next few months helping the ARVN recover from the Easter Offensive, primarily focused on training the new intake of recruits necessary to replace the heavy casualties sustained during the offensive. I left for home in December of 1972 feeling pretty good about the job I had done and also about the ARVN who had turned back the North Vietnamese at An Lac and Con Tum and, as the general pointed out, retook Quang Tri in the north. At this point, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and comment on the advisory effort written large. And these are general comments about the advisory effort and in some cases paralleled what Dr. Birtle said, and others are gleaned from personal experience as well as fairly extensive archival research on the topic. They are provided in no particular order. I would submit to you that one of the biggest problems from the earliest days with the Army effort was that once the U.S. ground troops began to deploy into theater, the 173rd Airborne, although the 1st Cav would like you to think they were first, they were second, the 1st Cav, the 1st Infantry Division, and all those other units followed, MACV's emphasis shifted away from the advisory effort into the big unit war. The result was that the advisory efforts were often understrength and filled with personnel who often didn't meet the requirements for the position in terms of rank, branch, and experience. The main qualification was often availability. I was a perfect example of that, albeit some years later. This meant that some who were selected for advisory duty were better suited for it than others. The problem was compounded, as Dr. Birtle said, by the fact that not everyone attended the training that was supposed to be required for being an advisor. Another key factor had to do with the individual 12-month advisory tours. Also, as Andy pointed out, these weren't really 12-month tours in most cases. This resulted in too much turbulence and impeded the development of trust and rapport between the advisor and his counterpart. The result on the ground was revolving door advisors. Later in the war, one senior ARVN officer reported having 37 advisors over the course of his career. The short tours provided advisors little the opportunity or incentive to tackle the long-term problems. And this is at the senior levels, I think, command and control, leadership, and the elimination of corruption. For those who were assigned as advisors, effectiveness was often inhibited by lack of familiarization with Vietnamese language, history, culture, and values. Yet with all these factors, the advisors soldiered on and did the best they could do to assist the South Vietnamese in generating combat capability while the big unit war focused on finding and eliminating the North Vietnamese and the main force VC unit. This situation changed somewhat with the emphasis when the emphasis shifted back to the advisory effort as the U.S. units began to pull out under Vietnamization. As it turned out, at least in my opinion, this shift in emphasis was too late. From a personal perspective, I found the advisory duty very difficult. The duty required decisiveness and aggressive pursuit of the mission, but also called for patience and restraint, a conflicted mix, to say the least. The reality on the ground often flew in the face of the need to report progress. That, coupled with unrealistic expectations of results from higher U.S. headquarters, had the potential to contribute to inaccurate and overly optimistic reporting. As a result, advisors walked a tightrope. You had to be involved and proactive, but you had to be careful not to stifle the commander's initiative. You had to have empathy for the counterpart. You had to understand the cultural and institutional constraints under which he worked. At the same time, you had to be honest about the progress of the unit and its leaders. Maybe most important, you had to build a relationship with one's counterpart without making him too dependent on advisors and/or U.S. combat and combat service support. Institutionally, this last requirement proved to be problematic as U.S. advisors were withdrawn and the South Vietnamese found themselves on their own. Shifting gears yet again, having to assess the advisory effort, I'd like to make a few comments about the combat capabilities of the ARVN from my perspective and experience. The Battle of An Lac in 1972 provided a unique perspective on evaluating South Vietnamese combat performance in the latter years of the war. All elements of the South Vietnamese ground forces, with the exception of the Vietnamese Marine Corps, were represented in the battle. There were 5 ARVN infantry regiments, an airborne brigade, an airborne ranger group, several border ranger elements, and the Ben Long regional forces and popular forces. All were represented in the forces that defended An Loc. Frankly, the South Vietnamese combat performance during the battle was uneven. Some units, the airborne brigade, the airborne ranger group, several of the ARVN infantry regiments were outstanding. Others, including several of the other ARVN infantry regiments, were not very good at all. The difference, as always is the case, was leadership. In many ways, then, the situation at An Loc provided a microcosm view of South Vietnamese combat capability at this point in the war. It was a mixed story. Nevertheless, President Nixon, in the wake of the 1972 Easter Offensive, hoping to rationalize the continuing U.S. withdrawal, lend credence to the peace accords that were being negotiated in Paris, declared Vietnamization a total victory, saying that the South Vietnamese were now capable of standing on their own against the NVA. It was true that the ARVN had stood against the best the NVA could throw at them, but it is also true that the massive application of American air power and the presence of U.S. advisors played a large role in that victory. That part of the narrative was left out in the haste to end U.S. involvement in the war. After the U.S. forces departed, the South Vietnamese armed forces performed well in 1973 during some of the heaviest fighting of the war. In fact, their casualty figures in 1973 were the 3rd highest of the war after 68 and 72. Decidedly not a ceasefire. However, in mid-74, they began to run short of critical supplies of material, as General Zinni already alluded to. They were relegated to fighting what President Nguyen Van Thu called a poor man's war. When Nixon, who had made 31 separate promises to Thu that the U.S. would be there to support South Vietnam, if the North Vietnamese launched a new offensive, resigned in disgrace, the South Vietnamese were stunned. Almost simultaneously, Congress reduced the appropriation for military aid to Saigon. Reeling from these 2 blows, and without the air power and advisors who had helped them turn back the NVA in 72, and less the promises of support made by Nixon, the South Vietnamese collapsed in just 55 days when the North Vietnamese launched Campaign 275 in the early days of 1975. That turned out to be, of course, the final offensive. In closing, I have to say, even with all the difficulties involved, and even knowing how it all turned out, that I'm proud of what I did as an advisor in Vietnam, and I only wish we could have done more. The South Vietnamese were good people, and they deserve better than they got. Thank you.
We have about a half hour of time for questions. We have a microphone in the center aisle, so if you do have a question, please go to the microphone. This presentation is being taped, so the only way that the tape will hear you is if you're at the microphone. So opened up to questions to any 3 of us.
Thought I'd break the ice. It's for General Zinni. One of the lessons I pulled from your talk, sir, was the fact that the exchange of officers coming back to the United States from South Vietnam was a real major factor in getting some of the positive results that ended up being their performance on the battlefield. Why do you think we didn't see that with Iraqi and Afghan officers? Why did we lose that lesson, or was there something missing in the exchange here, sir?
I think from what you heard about the description of the history of the advisory effort, we began with an advisory period before we committed U.S. units. So the period, actually going back to the 50s really, up to 65 was a major advisory effort. So in that time, we had learned a lot. There was a heavy investment in the advisory effort. I think as was mentioned before, when the U.S. units came in strength, the emphasis on the advisory effort dwindled a bit, came back toward the end, and I think 73, 75 as we withdrew. So I think the difference with Iraq and Afghanistan is we went in, and then I felt, because I looked at I was asked to look at some of the advisory planning. First of all, we didn't remember the lessons we learned, obviously, from Vietnam, but secondly, it was a secondary effort. It was attached on. We really thought this was our war, and we were going to win it that way. And I would say, that was the attitude we were beginning to see in the middle of the large U.S. commitment. They would often push aside the South Vietnamese units to do it themselves, and then complain about the South Vietnamese units not doing it. There were some enlightened commanders that didn't do it that way. One was General Larson, 3rd Corps commander, U.S. Army, and actually the 1st Air Cav commanders. They really tried to push the South Vietnamese into taking the lead. And what was great, of course, about the 1st Air Cav is they had a lot of lift assets, helicopters, and when we operated with them, the Vietnamese, I know Vietnamese Marines really liked it because the support was always there, the lift was always there, and they pushed the Vietnamese to be in the lead, which they wanted to do, the better units. But you found that very rarely. You found too many commanders, to be honest and frank with you, they were going to win the war on their tour. You know, and they didn't understand that the most important part of this was going to be developing that Vietnamese force to be able to handle the war and developing their skills as much as possible. So we had that in the beginning. It sort of waned in the middle, sort of came back, and we saw the benefits in the Easter offensive, and then cut off at the end.
Actually, I'd like to address this to all three panelists. Now, of course, building partner capacity is kind of the, one of the bywords. People talk about, yes, in the future, we need to improve this capability. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts as we look forward when we don't necessarily know what country is going to be the one that would be hopefully the beneficiary of our advisory efforts. How do we structure, in particular the Army and the Marine Corps, what do we do so that we're ready to implement an advisory effort now at perhaps very low scale, but then be able to gear up to the kind of effort that we subsequently had in Vietnam?
I'll take that first.
Yeah, I'll start, and obviously others. About 2 years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago, when General Conway was the Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, he held what's an annual conference of all the commandants, and they're not all Marine Corps, some naval infantry, but basically the grouping of those that have the closest affiliation with the Marine Corps. And he asked me to sort of host the thing, and the subject was counterinsurgency. And what I found interesting is all the Americans there were really espousing counterinsurgency doctrine, like we knew it, we got it. TRADOC, Quantico, all the sphincter muscles are right doctrine, where, we know what's going on here. And I watched the faces of all these people, especially those that came from countries that had ongoing or recent insurgencies. And one of the commanders sort of raised his hand and he said, you come into our country and you tell us how to fight the war, or what it's your model of insurgency that you're giving us. First of all, that may not be right. Second of all, we may not be able to do what you can do when you come in. So he asked a sincere question: shouldn't you look at this through our eyes and our capabilities and make adjustments? And we got in, that created a whole string of discussion. And it gets to your point. Part of it is, first of all, you better understand the environment. Second of all, you better understand the culture. You need to understand the dynamics of what's going on and how it's affected. I think in many ways, we sort of cookie cutter a doctrine and we go in and overlay it, and even if it doesn't fit, we're going to force it, try to force it. And I think you could create advisory efforts without specific orientation. The specifics are obviously language and culture. But you can teach how to appreciate culture. You can teach analytical methodology on how to take some of these things apart. I mean, there have been some great books written, I think, on Kilcullen's book on insurgency and others, that give you a deeper insight. Sometimes I think we go with too much of a mechanical approach as to how we're going to resolve this. And we don't see it in other terms. For example, we don't see it in terms of duration in many cases. There was no doubt in the Vietnamese Marines' minds that I was with, they were in a 20-year war. I don't think any American believed that was a 20-year war. McNamara kept saying we'd be home by Christmas. You picked a Christmas, you know, and it never happened that way. I do think you can teach those kinds of skills and then apply the specifics when it comes. And there's a lot more. I want to say that Special Forces knows how to do this. I mean, I've operated with SF teams around. They understand it clearly. Foreign internal development, insurgency doctrine, the immersion into the culture. I mean, they provide a great model. I think the MATA course and what they did in the Bragg during the Vietnam War was the best preparation we could have done. So there certainly are skill sets out there that we have now, in organizations like that can impart it and develop a cadre of advisors that we can apply where needed.
Jim, do you have any thoughts?
I agree with everything that General Zinni says, in particular with trying to put together these kinds of appreciations that are important to being an advisor. I will tell you that I'm not particularly heartened by the way we're doing it. We have a lot of emphasis on security assistance. You had folks like John Noggle talked about developing an advisory corps. That was a no-go, and it's always going to be a no-go. And that's my opinion only. You asked me for my opinion. And our generalist approach is that we're not going to do that. The supposition is, and it has been and probably always will be, that we can generate capability of X type, you fill in the blank, on short notice. I don't think that's correct, having watched how we put together the advisory teams for Iraq, both at Fort Benning and Fort Riley, that we answered our own question in that case. We did it, it was ad hocery at its best, people trying to do what was right, but we were trying to do it on the fly. I think there have been some efforts, the AFPAC Hands program, trying to teach an appreciation for culture and history at the staff college where I work, and those kinds of things. But in terms of setting aside, giving all the things that I'm speaking specifically about the Army here, has to do, I don't think we'll ever have the capability to build this core of advisors. What we probably need to focus is on those skill sets. And then you have to ask the question is, what about all those other skill sets that have to be done? You know, a captain could be a good advisor, but if he's an armor guy, you probably want to have been down a main gun range a couple of times if he's going to be a company commander. So there's a lot of competing requirements out there, and that's the real problem for the commanders today, I think, in the Army, is finding the right answer and not getting it too wrong.
Could I have one question? Oh, do you,
Let me just add one thing that just came to mind with discussion. As a combatant commander, a regional commander, one of the most valuable assets I had were FAOs, foreign area officers. And what used to kill me, they were extremely